Thank you, Sandra, for this introduction, and thank you for coming here, and thank you, Says, for inviting me and to talk to you tonight. The reason I'm here is because many opponents of legalization always point at the Netherlands and say, what goes wrong in the Netherlands since we legalized? And I hope at the end of my speech I have convinced you that nothing goes wrong in the Netherlands. So let's try and do that. First of all, I would like to tell you what we use as definition for euthanasia. It is important for the rest of my story. Euthanasia, in my opinion, is a deliberate termination of life by someone else, but on the explicit request of the person involved. So see that there is not a doctor in the definition. Anybody can, in this definition, perform euthanasia. But it also implies that what is not euthanasia, and I'm not talking about, and the law is not about, it's not about terminal or palliative sedation. That's another way of treating end-of-life decisions. We are not talking about double effect methods, so using morphine as a kind of double effect, saying you are actually treating the pain, but in the back of your head you mean to terminate the life or shorten it. We're also not talking about, when I talk about euthanasia, about non-voluntary termination of life, which is happening in the Netherlands, is happening everywhere in the world. And we're also not talking about non-treatment decisions. So taking away a ventilator or refusing antibiotics when there is a pneumonia, that is not euthanasia, that is medical treatment. And I put on the termination of the life of newborns because our opposition point at the Netherlands and say, you see, you started euthanizing adults and now you're already euthanizing newborns. May I remind you of our definition, there has to be a request and a newborn cannot raise the request, simple as that. And also in our Dutch law, we recognize two methods. That's because the penal code explicitly forbids euthanasia and assisted suicide. So we had to adapt our law in this way that we added articles which made it possible, and that is why we also use the term physician-assisted suicide, which is the same as euthanasia. It is an active act, terminating life, but the only thing is that you, as doctor, prescribe the medication, and the patient takes the medication himself. But the doctor is as responsible as with euthanasia. I will try to shortly tell you about the history. How come that we in the Netherlands have this law? I must be honest, Marshal Perron is speaking after me. The Northern Territory was the first country or territory or state or whatever, but the first to have a legalized euthanasia. But I could say that in the Netherlands we have the first country who have a law, and we don't have a federation which is taking it away. We started in '73 with a family doctor in the northern part who killed or who terminated the life of a patient. And she was found out, and she was prosecuted, and she was brought before court, and the court finally gave her a very symbolical conviction of 1 week on probation only. And the judge has been heard afterwards to say to her, if I'm as old as your mother, I hope you are my family doctor. Important of that case has been that from that beginning onward, the judge has asked the opinion of the experts, the doctors. So from the first line onwards, the Royal Dutch Medical Association, which is the letters RDMA, standing for, have been involved in our practice of euthanasia and have written down something like, as long as we know that our colleagues are doing it, we should make a protocol in order for them to do it in a careful way. It's important, it's the only medical association who has been supportive of legalizing euthanasia. So that's one of the problems maybe you have in Australia, but you have in all countries in the world where medical associations are opposing. After Dr. Posma in '73, we had more cases. Doctors started to use the criteria formulated by the judge in '73 to practice euthanasia, and some of the doctors were brave enough to go to the prosecutor and say, well, listen, I have done this act of euthanasia, and please show me whether I'm wrong or right. And they were prosecuted, Dr. Schoonheim in 84 and Chabot in 94, so 10 years apart. And these two went up to the Supreme Court in the Netherlands, and the Supreme Court in both cases acquitted those doctors. So forming a kind of case law, which more or less is the same as a normal law. So from then onwards, doctors in the Netherlands knew that they could practice euthanasia as long as they complied with the criteria which were formulated by that first judge in 73, and which still appear in our law of today. That is the doctor side, the practical side. The other side is more a political one. We always have in the Netherlands a coalition with different parties in the government, and there has always been Christian Democrats in the coalition, and the Christian Democrats always have been against legalizing euthanasia. So when there was some push from advocacy groups like the NVVE, or from even a political party, D66, the Liberal Democrats, the Christian Democrats Prime Minister probably thought he had a trick, a political trick. He made a commission, expecting this commission to go work for years on, produce a thick report which would disappear in a drawer. But that was not the case. This commission did good work. And the major work was that they put on a national survey, asking doctors in the Netherlands what they did in this field. What kind of decisions did they make? What kind of treatments did they take? And this survey was accompanied by letters from the Medical Association and from the prosecuting office, saying that whatever information you give, you will never be prosecuted on the basis of that information. So the doctors gave honest answers, and the response was over 80%, which means that we actually could produce figures on what was going on there. And that survey has been repeated every 5 years. So we know practically sure what is happening in practice, what the difference is between what is happening and what is officially reported. And finally, in 1999, the Minister of Health came with a bill in the Parliament, and it was discussed in Parliament. It was agreed in the Senate in 2001, and in 2002, it was finally in action. What is the law? It's important to realize, although it is legalized to do euthanasia, euthanasia is still in our penal code. So still, someone who performs euthanasia can be prosecuted on the basis of the penal code. But we added an article which say euthanasia is still a crime, but when a doctor is the one who does it, and that doctor follows the criteria, that doctor will not be prosecuted, will be free of prosecution, will stay outside the juridical pathway. What are those criteria? A request, I already said in the definition. If you don't have a request, you don't get euthanasia in the Netherlands. That request must be voluntary. Nobody else should push you to ask for euthanasia. The doctor has to sort of check if that is really the request of the person, and it has to be well considered. Don't come to the office of a family doctor in the Netherlands in the morning and expect to have euthanasia in the afternoon. That is not possible. You have to think about it, talk about it. The request is actually the start of a process. The second, and maybe the most important criterion, is that there should be unbearable and hopeless suffering. And I made the word "and" red, because I think it is one of the most important words in the whole law. What is the importance? There's only one person in this situation who can say that the suffering is unbearable. That is the patient. And what is unbearable for the patient might be bearable for someone else, for the doctor. So there's no problem. The patient can say, I am suffering unbearable, and the doctor has to accept that declaration. But what is the doctor doing? A doctor is in principle someone who wants to treat patients. So when the patient comes to him and says, I have unbearable suffering, he will try and offer treatments or possibilities to make the suffering bearable. And he will do that. He offered that, taking the request serious, and on the moment he sees he has no alternatives, he has no possibilities to make the suffering bearable, then there is what we call a hopeless situation. The doctor has no treatments. And that is where the word "and" is important, because there's the patient saying, I am suffering unbearably, and the doctor says, I cannot do anything about it. And they together decide that this is the moment where euthanasia is a possibility. And when that is reached, the doctor has to consult a second independent doctor. This independent doctor is not doing the whole diagnosis and things again. He just reads the medical files, he talks to the patient to see whether everything is all right. And you must see that his function is mainly to protect the doctor of falling in a pitfall, being involved too much with the history of the patient. If the consultation doctor says, okay, you have followed all the criteria, then you have to do it as a good medical practice. You have to use the right medication. So the pharmacists and the Doctors Association have made a protocol saying you use this or that medication. And finally, you report your case to the regional review committees. There's 5 in the whole country who review all the cases which are reported. If you have followed all those criteria and the review committee says it is all right, then you will stay out the legal system. Now we will skip toward why is it that people say there is a danger? What is the danger? 3 major things are mentioned always. There's a slippery slope we are going on in the Netherlands. They say that legalizing euthanasia will make a big change and not a positive change in society. They will have other attitudes toward doctors, between doctors and patients. And last of all, we hear always that we legalize euthanasia in the Netherlands because we didn't have palliative care, and if you could give good palliative care, you don't need euthanasia. I will try to show you that those allegations are not true. The first slippery slope everybody says is once you start voluntary euthanasia, you immediately will see a development into the direction of involuntary euthanasia. In other words, I always say, if you give the doctor one finger, he will take the whole hand. That is far from true. One of the big dangers before we had the law was in 1990 in the first Remling report, as it was called. Doctors told us that 1,000 times a year they terminated the life without a request from the patient, which is 1,000 of Remling. And I still, up till today, I meet opposition parties who tell us that we have those 1,000 of Remling. If we really have the slippery slope, if we really see doctors taking the whole hand, this percentage would have gone up, having been more. Instead, in 2012, the last survey, it was 0.2%, so it went down. Another figure which I didn't put on the slide is that in countries like Belgium or Flanders and Australia, where there was the same sort of research, it turned out that this non-voluntary euthanasia happened in 4 to 5 times as much as in the Netherlands, where there was a tolerated practice. So not having a practice made this bigger. So certainly that is not a slippery slope. Another one is that you say, or they say, you start with cancer and you end up with completed life. Let's say just the other side. I can show you some figures from the review committee annual reports. Don't look at the numbers, they are too small, but look at the color of the bars. The green colors is the percentage of cancer, terminal cancer situation where euthanasia was practiced. You see indeed that that percentage is going down a little bit. It goes down from 85 to 75% of all cases of euthanasia. So there is more non-cancer situations, but that is because cancer is more or less considered at this moment as a normal situation where doctors, of course, practice euthanasia. And so we have more room, more space, more emotional space to think about other conditions who cause unbearable and hopeless suffering, like even psychiatry, early dementia, neurological, pulmonological, cardiological situation. And that is why you see the red bit growing a little bit. But I don't certainly think that this is a sign of a slippery slope. This is a normal development once you have a law. And for the rest, we did not have to change our law to make this possible. So that also is proof. The last one is that they say, if you legalize euthanasia, there will be a danger for vulnerable people, for handicapped people. The poor and the very old people, they will be killed all the time or euthanized all the time. We have done research in the States, in the Netherlands, and I think even in Australia. Who is making use of the euthanasia law? White people, highly educated and eloquent, and certainly not vulnerable. You could even change it around and say that the vulnerable people do not get the rights that the highly educated white people get. So no sign of whatever slippery slope on that field. What about the changes in society? There is no sign of damage to doctor-patient relationship. One of the fears people say which will happen. Imagine that you are the patient in a practice where the doctor practices euthanasia. You may be the next one he is going to kill. That is not true. Even in some research it is shown that in Netherlands and Belgium, two countries who have legalized euthanasia, have the highest figures when you see at patient trust in doctors. So there is no sign that it damages. I even say the opposite is happening. We see that patients go to the doctor, ask what their opinion on euthanasia is, and if they say we are against, then they change from doctor to a doctor who they can trust. So it is the other way around. And the last one can also be phrased as a funny one. Some people say, if you are 65 years or older, don't go to the Netherlands on holiday, because if you are ill and admitted to hospital, you will be killed. Of course, that's not true. Please come to the Netherlands. It's a nice country. We have a nice city. More than 85% of all euthanasia cases are being performed with the family doctor in the homes of the patients who die. So no sign of being killed on every corner of the street. The palliative care. People say we didn't have palliative care, that's why we make euthanasia. If you look at palliative care and you ask people, why do you ask for euthanasia? This is a possibility. We can ask people because it is legal to ask. You see, the most reasons have to do with meaningless suffering, with deterioration, prevention of it, total weakness, dependence, loss of dependence. And only on the 6th or 7th place we have pain. And yes, of course, palliative care is doing more than only pain treatment. But even the best palliative care is not able to make all decisions dignified. And by the way, at this moment, the Netherlands is at 5th place in the European list of best palliative care provisions. So we don't have any complaints. There's money enough, and the palliative care is actually integrated in the whole healthcare system. I come to a conclusion, some conclusions. I think if you talk about legalizing euthanasia, you should consider euthanasia as an act to end suffering. And yes, the only way to do that is to end the life, to terminate the life. But talking about euthanasia, it's better to talk about terminating suffering. And the second one is, and I hope that I have proved it to you, that over 35 years of Dutch tolerated and legalized practice have not shown any sign of slippery slope. Thank you for your attention.
Over the last 20 years, we have heard the words, "No safeguards can be devised to protect the vulnerable," ad nauseum during the voluntary euthanasia debate. One could say that statement is the reason no legislation has made it through a state parliament to date. Sheepish politicians, wary of what they see as a controversial issue, have grasped at these words to avoid studying the subject in detail. Had they delved into the matter seriously, they would realise the folly of the claim. The need for safeguards is at the very core of legislation to permit voluntary euthanasia. Safeguards are not, as many people believe, aimed at helping the person seeking assistance to die. Avoiding misdiagnosis by requiring multiple doctors to confirm the nature and prognosis of disease is the only safeguard directly aimed at the applicant. We want to ensure that they are not motivated by a false understanding of their medical condition. Other safeguards, like assessment for depression, coercion, knowledge of palliative care options, cooling off periods, witnesses, interpreters, record keeping and oversight, are all aimed at convincing the rest of us that the so-called vulnerable will not be unwillingly caught up in the process and helped to die when they really didn't want to. Politicians who make the statement, "No safeguards can be devised to protect the vulnerable," are wrong. They misrepresent the authority Parliament has to deal with this issue. Your Parliament has actually some quite extraordinary powers. It can abrogate or curtail a fundamental right, freedom or immunity. Your Parliament can make laws that include or exclude people from an activity on the grounds of sex, age, race, religion, health, geography, wealth, and even time. For example, we could restrict voluntary euthanasia to South Australian residents who are over 80, atheists, and have motor neuron disease. As well, they must have been members of SAVES for at least 5 years and declared their wish for voluntary euthanasia before they were diagnosed as terminally ill. And to round it off, we could ensure that they forfeited their estate to the Crown and had to be cremated on a Friday 1 month after their death. Of course, you wouldn't do that. The point I'm making is, tell me who the vulnerable are and I will draft a law to exclude them. It's in fact that simple. All that is needed is politicians of goodwill who agree that there is a need to sit down and devise a mix of reasonable conditions to be met before a citizen can request and receive assistance to die, in the company of whomever they choose. In 1995, in the Northern Territory, we did just that. The Rights of the Terminally Ill Act was appropriately named. That law bestowed a right to a particular group of people to seek and obtain medical assistance to die from a doctor willing to participate in the process. There were no precedents at the time, and I decided to restrict eligibility to the terminally ill, despite the valid case to extend coverage to the hopelessly ill, but not terminally ill. Here is a flowchart of the safeguards in that legislation. There were 21 steps, including 2 cooling off periods required before assistance to die could be provided. That's what's called running the gauntlet. 8 more checkpoints were followed, the death, which were safeguards of paperwork, reporting to coroners, reporting to Parliament, etc., etc. If the process got held up anywhere along that flowchart, it stopped, and no assistance could be given to the person to die. Only steps 2 and 6, I'm not sure if you can read them from there, are actually related to the individual applicant. They're the two steps. The first one is that the doctor must confirm diagnosis and prognosis, that they actually have a disease, because, as you may know, occasionally people think they have something they don't have, or a second opinion gives a different opinion. And step 6, a specialist in the disease is required to confirm that diagnosis and prognosis. They're the only ones really directed at the applicant. All the rest, as I say, are to keep the rest of us happy, that this process won't get out of hand. Having caught the opponents by surprise when I announced that a voluntary euthanasia bill would be introduced, I had a couple of days in the media to clearly explain what was proposed and what was not proposed, before the opposition got mobilised and began to distort it, which I was sure what was going to happen. I wanted to try and get the picture clearly understood in the community and argue facts, not fiction. And I knew I had been successful with my surprise announcement and having control of the media for the first couple of days, when a reporter subsequently pulled up one of the opponents on camera saying, "But that's not what the sponsor's proposing." So I actually had the media working for me in trying to keep people on track. Because if there was one thing I learned in politics, it was try and keep on subject and try hard to avoid being dragged down a path that was off subject. You could just spend all your energy and you're just wasting your time. So the surprise launch was successful. Unfortunately, subsequent movers of bills don't have that surprise opportunity that I had. A coalition of the Catholic Church and other churches and the AMA did soon mobilise, and they were well funded and they were dishonest. The fabrications and the doomsday predictions we have become used to in the 20 years since that legislation were all trotted out. And here's an example of one of them. A very professional, full-page advertisement, no doubt effective, classic scaremongering. And in fact, it was interesting that all the things they said the bill didn't do was the situation when you don't have legislation. And however, that's the sort of thing we faced in the Northern Territory during the campaign to try and stop what we were trying to do. The 32 bills introduced in Australia over the last 20 years, yes, there were 32 bills introduced from 1995 until late last year. But all of those 32 bills followed a similar theme to the territory law, with variations aimed at addressing particular concerns that were raised by objectors. Common to all the state bills are provisions designed to ensure that the request to die is genuine, enduring, informed, and without coercion. That diagnosis and prognosis is correct, and there are no treatment options available that are acceptable to the person. In conclusion, there are in fact many combinations of safeguards that will work. However, we should never lose sight of who we're trying to help when deciding what hurdles they have to jump before being granted assistance. Let's not make it too hard to qualify so people just give up and go and buy a piece of rope like they're doing today. I close with an advertisement which was made a couple of years ago and banned from Australian television by the Australian Communications and Media Authority. They said Australian audiences should not be exposed to such dangerous material.
Australians have a proud history of fighting for our rights, like the right to vote, the right to a fair working week, the right to own land, the right to be treated with respect regardless of background. Today, we all enjoy the right to live exactly the way we want. Yet we still don't have the right to choose how we want to die if we're faced with the torture of a terminal disease. Fair go, Australia. Speak out for your last right now. Visit yourlastright.com before it's too late. Authorised by Neil Francis, Melbourne.
The first thing in that opinion was he spent some time looking at the moral issues. I mean, I would have thought you go to a associate professor of law, you're looking at the legal issues, but it was interesting that he recognised within this debate there is a moral aspect to what's going on here. And he did examine the slippery slope argument and effectively dismissed it. And more interestingly, and I found this a bit unusual in an opinion, was that in his opinion it was a full page of quotes from Father Frank Brennan in there, who was not a supporter. He was obviously misunderstood what Marshall was trying to do and got it wrong. But Frank had managed to link it somehow to abortion, and then ran the argument that, well, Aboriginal people wouldn't understand it, so it's therefore damaging to their health, and they wouldn't go to doctors and things like this. Which I felt was a little insulting to Aboriginal people. And the opinion from the professor, the first thing was, is it legal in our law? And of course it was. It was legal. It was a valid Northern Territory law. The only problem that they had there was, of course, that the feds had kept for themselves this capacity to overrule it, which they duly did, unfortunately. So that first step, in terms of what South Australia's doing, voluntary euthanasia law in South Australia will, of course, be legal, and the courts will uphold it. So that was a good thing. The next point he really turned to was this question of the interaction with international human rights, and in particular the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And that's because Section 6 of that talks about human rights and our right to life. And it says, every human being has the inherent right to life. This right shall be protected by law. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his life. Now, it's interesting. You've got a right to life, but it's not a guaranteed right to life because, of course, we can kill people in our society, and we do. I mean, some of the ones are obvious. Some of the things we do to kill people are in self-defence. I mean, it happens here in our state, not on an irregular basis. Unfortunately, it's an extreme example, but if you are killing someone in self-defence, then of course you're able to deprive them of their life legally. So that's one way to do it. The other way, of course, is euthanasia by admission. And so, I mean, we are in a way already depriving people of their life by not keeping them alive. And that's accepted. So the professor's opinion was, really that we get to a stage that there is a right to deprive a person of their life if it's within strict controls and has a sense of proportionality. And that, in the professor's view, it meant that the bill, the Northern Territory bill he was talking specifically about, wasn't inconsistent with Section 6. So it wasn't inconsistent with our international rights and obligations. Now, at this stage, no Australian court has ruled on our rights as a human right versus euthanasia, but there have been other ones. And there's been a recent Canadian case of Carter and Canada, which was only decided in February of this year. And that arose because Canada, fortunately, has a Charter of Rights and Freedom. And that charter in Section 7 says, everyone has a right to life, liberty and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. Now, that's something we don't have here, a Bill of Rights, nor do we have a statement like that that's enforceable. In Canada, however, they had a criminal code that made it an offence to aid and abet a suicide. Now, fortunately, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, with the families of Kay Carter and Gloria Taylor, both of whom were suffering significant degenerative diseases, so they knew the path of their disease, they knew what was likely to happen to them. They challenged that, and the Canadian Supreme Court held, and I'll read it out to you. It said, Section 7 is rooted in a deep respect for the value of human life, but Section 7 also encompasses life, liberty, and security of a person during the passage to death. It is for this reason that the sanctity of life is no longer seen to require that all human life be preserved at all cost. And it goes on to say that the law has come to recognise that in certain circumstances, an individual's choice about the end of their life is entitled to respect. So effectively, in my opinion, that is a statement that elevates what I see as a human right into a human right in Canada, at least, that is now protected by law. So in summary, that voluntary euthanasia is a human right that is recognised, and it doesn't infringe upon our other rights that we have. So there's no reason at law that we should in any way reject a well-drafted but simple and without too many complicated safeguards, just to assist those who object to it feel more comfortable about it, I think would be a very worthwhile thing. I find it difficult to understand why more politicians don't actually see it as something that is of significance and value to the people. It's cheap, it doesn't require millions of dollars to run it, and it is a fundamental right that I feel that we are being denied. Thank you.
It seems to me that we should have a system that's easy to access and that does come back to the individual making a conscious choice to follow through with that particular proposal for ending their life. Probably unconventionally, I really think that it comes back to a rights issue, and that with a certain amount of support and also medical advice, that people should be able to make up their own mind about this. I, as a politician, know that there's things that you have to put in legislation, otherwise there's absolutely no way your colleagues would even contemplate supporting the legislation. But I really think that one of the problems that we've had, and the Consent to Medical Treatment and Palliative Care Act, I think when with my friend here, Mark Parnell, tried to amend that act, I think it got a bit too complicated. We spent hours and hours, and fortunately Mark's a lawyer, I don't have that background, tried to make sure that we had all bases covered and that nobody could complain about there not being enough safeguards in there. But really, we came up with a very complicated, I think, system. So since that time, I think we've both learned a lesson. We've been looking at a more simplified approach. And actually, because the community in general, as you've heard, at least 75%, I think the latest news poll's even higher, number of people in the community support the choice of voluntary euthanasia. So it seems to me we, like the Advance Directives campaign, we should try and make the access and the choice as simple as possible, and that we should also give people an opportunity to change their mind if they decide that's not where they want to go. Now, whether we could get that sort of legislation up in the state parliament, I don't know, but I'm becoming more and more to the view that we should keep it simple, and we should actually keep on arguing the case and trying to dispel the myths that have been put forward by the naysayers. And I think Dr. Jonquière certainly covered that beautifully tonight, as has Marshall and as has Stephen. So all of those things need to be part of the arguments that we use in Parliament. So what to the future? We've got a number of new MPs. We know where Nat stands, so we don't have to lobby her. We've got a few other new ones in the House of Assembly, so it would be very helpful for those of you that do support reform in this area if you did talk to our newer MPs, particularly if you're in their electorate. The other thing would be useful is if you could join the fantastic groups that we have that are lobbying and that are activists in the Reform campaign. I'm inspired by them, and there's a number of them. I think most of you have got this leaflet, which is the latest one that's been put out. And we've got groups like SAVES, which has been going for 32 years. That's a pretty good track record for an organisation. We've got some newer organisations like Lawyers for Death and Dignity, and you've already heard from them. We've got Doctors for Voluntary Euthanasia Choice. We've got Saviour, which is another newer organisation, which is Syndicated Australian Voluntary Euthanasia Youth Advocates. Quite inspiring group that also look at a whole lot of different methods of getting over their more modern methods of getting over their message. Christians Supporting Choice for Voluntary Euthanasia, South Australian Nurses Supporting Choices in Dying. So they're some of the really important groups that have provided fora for different debate and discussion. And I must say, and I know that my fellow members of Parliament really appreciate not only the work you do, but also the fact that you're prepared to keep on keeping on. Thank you very much.
I don't see this as an act of bravery or anything special coming out and standing up for what is right. I don't see this being anything other than doing my job as a Member of Parliament. As Nat Cook, the member for Fisher, and John Dawkins up there, Upper House member, could I just say that John Dawkins is a champion for suicide prevention programs in South Australia as well. So there's a whole range of issues we're covering. And with Jerry and Mark, and with Kelly, it's nothing more than doing our job, and that's representing our constituents. And this is what a conscience vote is all about. I'm not going to go through the nuts and bolts. We've heard what Rob and Marshall and Stephen said tonight. They've covered all of that. But from a parliamentarian's point of view, I'm not my constituents' delegate. My views aren't their views. I'm here to represent their views. The overwhelming number of my constituents are in favour of voluntary euthanasia. And I just find it atrocious when I hear my colleagues stand up in Parliament and say, I know, and I could name the fellow, but I won't. This fellow said, I know that 80% of my constituents are in favour, but I don't believe in it, so I'm not going to vote for it. Now, that is, to me, is shameful. What are you there for? Where's the democracy in that? Where is the democracy in that? You need to make sure that your members of Parliament are representing your views. And you need to ask them, put them on the spot. Ask them, how will you vote? Why will you vote in a particular way? I am looking forward to the next Irish referendum because I guarantee I know what it's going to be on. Won't that put the cat amongst the pigeons? I joined the Liberal Party, not a Conservative party, so I am very proud of what the Liberal Party is doing, and with the range of views we've got. I should tell you a little story. Steph and I nearly got one bill up in Parliament. I can't even remember which one of the versions it was, but anyway, the vote, there were a few people speaking on the second reading speech, and I'll tell you, look, a lot of the members of Parliament don't speak because they don't want their views recorded, because they know that some of the anti-voluntary euthanasia people will send their speeches out and try and denigrate their views and their stances. But anyway, we'd been through the second reading speeches, and it was put to the vote, and we got it through on the voices. And anyway, next thing, all hell broke out. And a day or two later, the vote was recommitted. It went down by a very narrow majority, and we're back to where we are. But we won't give up. We won't give up, because this is a human right. As a Member of Parliament, I remember during the stem cell debate, I was called Dr. Mengele. You get called some terrible things. My wife's had letters written to her telling her to pray for me because I'm going to hellfire and damnation. So look, it's a very personal thing. It's a very public thing, but it's one of those things where you do have to, I suppose, have the courage of your convictions to know that you are doing what your constituents want you to do. The little bit of weight I've put on is just the thicker skin I've developed, okay? and the need to make sure that you don't get distracted. I was in government for 2 hours and 55 minutes. I told Steph at the last election, you won't win, you probably won't win, but she did. So that's the only thing Mike Brown and I have in common. And can I just say what a pleasure it is to work with Steph on these sorts of issues. It was a day of sex and death today. Steph had the meeting with the members of the sex workers lobby group, and I was with Marshall Perron for lunch, so we had a differing avenues of agenda, but it's been something that we are very, very keen to continue to work on. The numbers of groups that are supporting this cause now is getting broader and broader. And as I said to one chap outside the Catholic Church in High Street at Glenelg when I was putting up one of my posters, he said, "Is that guy still pushing euthanasia?" I said, "It's not compulsory, but and I can say that even in my electorate, where it does tend to be a little bit more conservative than others, that there is a very, very strong support for what I'm doing. And I'm pleased to be able to do that as their representative. And that's what it's about. So tonight is just another brick in the wall for me to try and represent the cause that we have here that's been backed by Francis, backed by Steph, backed by Rob and Marshall and Stephen, and backed by all of you. So can I thank you for coming tonight? Can I thank you for the support that you're showing in maintaining the pressure on us, we members of Parliament, because I know that the people that are here tonight, first thing you learn in politics is how to count. Okay, so the few members of Parliament here tonight don't represent the whole of the Parliament. We're getting closer. We've got 20 members of Parliament coming tomorrow night to a reception we're having in Parliament House with Rob and Marshall. We are as close as we've ever been. We might actually get a bit closer this next time, but Steph and I and my other colleagues here tonight, I can guarantee we will never, never, never give up.
All of you who support voluntary euthanasia who haven't done so, please contact your local member and just tell them that you support voluntary euthanasia and you want them to do something about it. You don't have to push them as to what is your view about voluntary euthanasia. You're really pushing them to support the electorate's view on voluntary euthanasia. And don't get put off by their staff. Politicians are very good at being busy all the time, and so they should be. Busy looking after their constituents, and you're exactly them. So what I suggest you do is contact your local member and wait, be patient, because you want to see them, no one else, for a brief conversation. You might wait for weeks. That's okay. You're a constituent. You're entitled to a meeting with your local politician. So please, if you haven't done it, do it. I sadly have had quite a number of politicians say to me, I've been in Parliament for 10 years, you say there's 80% of the people support it. I have never had a single representation on the issue, never. And that's unacceptable. And the only people who can change it, here we are.
I am very proud of the Dutch law, not because I cooperated in forming it, but because in hindsight, I see that the law actually accommodates all the situations we up till now have been helping in suicide. And why does it do it? Because the law only sketches a cadre, says there must be a request and there must be unbearable and hopeless suffering. So no criteria like it must be a terminal illness, no criterion like you have to die within 6 months. Nothing of that all. And if the doctor and the patient together decide that they comply with those two major criteria, these two people together decide what safeguards there should be built in for that situation. And every time, again, a doctor has to develop a new decision with a new patient. You never can say, next time I knew how it happened, so next time I do it the same way. So we don't have many safeguards, and that is maybe my advice to South Australia, to other countries, to take away all the safeguards as much as you can. I talked to the AMA this afternoon, and actually they told me they were going to ask advice from the World Medical Association. And I was afraid of that action, because I know from my colleagues from the Royal Dutch Medical Association, who are members of the World Medical Association, that every meeting, the first thing the World Medical Association do is accuse the Dutch doctors of being criminals because they support euthanasia. So I'm afraid that any advice from our Dutch colleagues won't go further than what I did. I just told them this afternoon they should not be afraid, and they should change their stance from opposing to at least neutral stance, and leave it to individual doctors to decide if they would comply with requests or not. At this moment, doctors won't comply with requests because they are afraid of being punished by their professional group. So if they change the stance to neutral, I think that would be a good development. The second, and maybe the most important criterion, is that there should be unbearable and hopeless suffering. And I made the word "and" red, because I think it is one of the most important words in the whole law. What is the importance? There's only one person in this situation who can say that the suffering is unbearable. That is the patient. And what is unbearable for the patient might be bearable for someone else, for the doctor. So there's no problem. The patient can say, I am suffering unbearable, and the doctor has to accept that declaration. But what is the doctor doing? A doctor is in principle someone who wants to treat patients. So when the patient comes to him and says, I have unbearable suffering, he will try and offer treatments or possibilities to make the suffering bearable. And he will do that. He offered that, taking the request serious, and on the moment he sees he has no alternatives, he has no possibilities to make the suffering bearable, then there is what we call a hopeless situation. The doctor has no treatments. And that is where the word "and" is important, because there's the patient saying, I am suffering unbearably. And the doctor says, I cannot do anything about it. And they together decide that this is the moment where euthanasia is a possibility.
The 32 bills introduced in Australia over the last 20 years, yes, there were 32 bills introduced from 1995 until late last year. But all of those 32 bills followed a similar theme to the territory law, with variations aimed at addressing particular concerns that were raised by objectors. Common to all the state bills are provisions designed to ensure that the request to die is genuine, enduring, informed, and without coercion, that diagnosis and prognosis is correct, and there are no treatment options available that are acceptable to the person. Variations between state bills have been in areas like eligibility. Should the hopelessly ill be included? The form of assistance permitted. Is it limited to self-administration, or can the doctor administer a lethal drug? Should a psychiatric report be required? The number of witnesses and cooling off periods required differed between different bills. Oversight is another area with wide variation. Some bills stipulating simply that the Attorney-General table an annual report on the operation of the law. Others establishing large committees with wide powers to monitor activity under the law and even power to intervene in individual applications. Horrors on that one. Some bills sought to establish a register of requests that institutions could access, and others would permit advance directives to allow euthanasia after a person lost competence or was unable to communicate. Some proposals required a doctor to remain with the applicant until death, others did not. All bills limited applicants to residents of the state. That was not the case in the Northern Territory, which in hindsight might have been a mistake. Not a moral mistake, but a political mistake. A good demonstration of the different approaches taken to allay concerns is the Victorian bill dictated that lethal drugs could not be delivered by needle, whereas a Western Australian bill said that drugs could only be administered by a doctor via a needle. That was the case of Victoria wanting to prevent opponents using a scare tactic, alleging every doctor with a syringe in their hand was a threat, whereas Western Australia tried to avoid suggestions of failed attempts to orally ingest drugs by insisting that only the doctor could do it by direct injection. So that's just the two attitudes of different politicians trying to get a bill to succeed through Parliament by addressing different concerns. I guess it shows to some degree the dilemma in settling on a set of safeguards that are as universally acceptable as you can. The situation in the 8 places overseas where a right to die exists is similar only in regard to the core safeguards. The applicant must act voluntarily, be informed, and multiple medical opinions to confirm diagnosis. Regimes in the USA apply only to the terminally ill and allow only assisted suicide. The Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg permit a doctor to administer lethal drugs as well. The Netherlands and Belgium do not require terminal illness. However, the person must be in constant and unbearable physical or mental suffering that is unrelievable. Assistance is not limited to adults. Belgium leads in combining voluntary euthanasia as a last resort palliative care option. The situation in Switzerland is unique. This is the only place where outsiders can be assisted to die. And despite voluntary euthanasia being illegal, the law on assisting a suicide in Switzerland states that it is not an offence if the assistance rendered is not for selfish reasons. It seems that the person being assisted in Switzerland need not be an adult or ill, and the person assisting need not be an adult or a doctor. In practice, however, Swiss organisations only assist people who are terminally ill or who have severe physical and mental illnesses. The person must take the lethal drugs orally. But I've always thought if ever there was going to be a society that crumbled away because of the way they treated the dying, it would have to be Switzerland. If it's not an offence to assist a suicide, providing you don't benefit from the suicide, from the death, then it's really sort of open slather, you could say. So all those people who predict doomsday, when we've got 30 steps of safeguards in a piece of legislation, haven't looked at Switzerland. And the Swiss situation has been as it is, I think, since the Second World War, or for 60 years or something. In conclusion, there are in fact many combinations of safeguards that will work. However, we should never lose sight of who we're trying to help when deciding what hurdles they have to jump before being granted assistance. Let's not make it too hard to qualify so people just give up and go and buy a piece of rope like they're doing today. I close with an advertisement which was made a couple of years ago and banned from Australian television by the Australian Communications and Media Authority. They said Australian audiences should not be exposed to such dangerous material.
Australians have a proud history of fighting for our rights, like the right to vote, the right to a fair working week, the right to own land, the right to be treated with respect regardless of background. Today, we all enjoy the right to live exactly the way we want. Yet we still don't have the right to choose how we want to die if we're faced with the torture of a terminal disease. Fair go, Australia. Speak out for your last right now. Visit yourlastright.com before it's too late. Authorised by Neil Francis, Melbourne.